But the idea of emancipated, strong women taking a part in politics is very Greek.
Queen Gorgo was a formidable politician. Spartan women were trained to battle just like the men. Had Persia marched directly on Sparta, the last line of defense probably would have been Spartan women who could fight very, very well.
Consider the fate of your women.
Clearly, you don't know our women. I might as well have marched them up here, judging by what I've seen.
When Spartan men went off to fight, it's absolutely certain that they could do so really confidently because they knew that their women were back at home, keeping the city-state going and supporting them as warriors, because this is what Spartan women had been brought up to do, and they were taught to want their sons to die for the state. This wasn't a problem, so you find that when Spartan warriors are killed, the women don't mourn as they do everywhere else in the Greek world. The women smile because they know that their son has died for his cause, and his cause is dying for the Spartan city-state.
Come back with your shield. Or on it.
Yes, my lady.
The fact that Gorgo says to Leonidas in the film, come back with your shield or on it, is absolutely appropriate because we know that this is what a Spartan woman said to her warrior husband in real historical terms. We also know that Leonidas said to Gorgo as he was leaving, marry a good man and have good children, because he knew he was never going to come back.
A lot of the dialogue that's in this film is derived, for the most part, from Herodotus. When you hear warnings about the multitude of Persian arrows that will darken the sun,
our arrows will blot out the sun.
And the Spartans scoff and say,
then we will fight in the shade.
They loved coming out with these really swift, really cute put-downs. When Leonidas is fighting at the Battle of Thermopylae, the Persian emperor asks the Spartans to put down their weapons.
Spartans! Lay down your weapons!
And Leonidas says, hey, just come and get them from us. He goes, molon labe. It's a great moment.
Persians! Come and get them!
all of these things not only are in the film to appeal to a modern audience, but they're in the histories of Herodotus to appeal to an ancient reader, because we have that human appreciation for courage and the underdog that transcends time and space. Thermopylae in Greek means the hot gates, and it's a pass in northern Greece. And what's unusual about it is it's only a few hundred yards and then abruptly cascades off into a cliff and in the sea. And what that meant is throughout antiquity, a small number of soldiers could block that pass and force an invader from the north to either make an enormous detour of 200 or 300 or 400 miles, or they'd have to blast their way through a very narrow bottleneck.
If you imagine yourself on a Greek battlefield, then essentially you'd have two forces in the rectangular, shield and spear, each man covering a third of the one next to him. Picture a train wreck, because that's what the battle was like.
What was really, really important to them was to defend the man on their left with this shield, so that they moved together en masse. I mean, it was described by contemporary authors as being like some hideous monster that moved as one.
In the phalanx, everybody's visibly apparent to everybody else. You can see there's a man on your right, there's a man in front of you, there's a man behind you, you're pushing, you're sweating, you're grunting.
And actually, you can imagine that's an incredibly effective way to fight, because it's very, very, very difficult to penetrate and very, very difficult to break through that rank. So even though there were tiny numbers of Spartans, they managed to hold their own by sticking in this phalanx, by fighting as one rather than fighting as individuals.
It was hideous. They ripped each other to pieces. I believe that in fiction, in cartooning, and in cinema, there's a long and worthy history of stylized violence, where you get across the idea of it rather than the actual reality. There was no way to tell the story of 300 without it being amazingly brutal.
On vase paintings, they showed individual warriors stabbing and slicing, even though we know that that didn't take place nearly as much as mass pushing and stabbing. And in the 300, there's something like that where the soldiers fight, not always in a phalanx, and they fight individually, and some of their weaponry, the swords, look like they're almost out of a Greek vase painting. They're highly ornate, and of course the soldiers don't have armor on, at least to the full extent. And it's another way of trying to convey courage, individual skill, physical excellence.
Xerxes surrounded himself with this elite force called the Immortals. And they were known as the Immortals in the Greek world because the Greeks couldn't get their heads around the fact that every time one of them died, another one seemed to pop up in its place. And they actually didn't know whether there was something supernatural or spiritual going on here, or whether there was just such an amazing reserve.
The Persian Immortals were called immortal because they never got bigger or smaller. There was always somebody to make up roughly a force of 10,000. But they're the shock troops.
The Greeks were very suspicious of the Immortals, very troubled by them. Even the Spartans were anxious when they knew that the Immortals were hitting the field. So I think that's why it's brilliant in the film that the Immortals have been represented as these kind of strange demonic figures, because in the heads of the Greeks who were fighting that day, that is how they would have seemed to them.
If you said the Immortals were these soulless creatures, they were demons, you see a monster. You don't see, you know, a Spartan doesn't go, oh, so when you say demon, you mean like a really angry guy.
When the Persian Immortals meet the best of the Greek hoplites, that is the Spartan 300, the royal guard and their king, what's going to happen? And you think there's going to be some suspense, but there's no suspense, because it turns out that a Spartan hoplite is far superior, even given his reduced numbers. I think as a classicist and ancient historian, when we look at modern adaptations of what we think happened, or at least the sanctity of ancient texts say what happens, and we want to be purist, we would like every single thing in Herodotus to be there. And there's not in Herodotus a rhinoceros, and there would not be a rhinoceros. But as critics, we're also supposed to be critics of literature, then we're trying to say to ourselves, why wouldn't a rhinoceros be there? It represents savagery, ferocity, something foreign, evil, incomprehensible. And so the filmmaker decides to use these conventions in the way he feels fit.
We don't actually know that much about Ephialtes in real historical terms. We know that he was a local, and we know that he was somebody who went over to the Persians. But he quickly became demonized by history, so it's no surprise in a way that he ends up in the film as this kind of embittered hunchback.
Ephialtes was generally known just to be a shepherd. I turned him into a hunchback because I wanted to stress just how rough the Spartans were and how he shouldn't have survived, I mean, by Spartan law. And his parents got him away into the mountains, but he always wanted to be a Spartan. I wanted him to be a pathetic figure, and often in cartooning, you make someone's physicality a metaphor for their interior reality.
That's something that the screenwriters and writers have tried to draw out of Herodotus. In Herodotus, we really don't get that degree of information. We're just told that Ephialtes was a traitor and was given financial rewards by the Persians for showing him the route around the back of the pass.
And of course, this is where the trouble really begins, because it means that the Persians can go up along the path and get round behind the back of Leonidas and his troops, which is a big problem.
Why do they do that? They all have to have personal motivations, or they want to become enriched, because no Greek in his right mind would give up freedom for autocracy.
In fact, that was something that happened a lot of the time. You know, the Greeks were half in love with the Persians. These were the big boys. These were the boys with the money and the big troops. And half of the Greeks thought it was a very good idea to kind of lay down and go over and be taken over by the Persian Empire. So the fact that Ephialtes represents this kind of Judas figure, the Greek who was a traitor, the Greek who medized is how they talked about it in the ancient world, a Greek who went over to the Persians, was very, very significant.
May you live forever.
To a Spartan, that's the ultimate insult, because, you know, the Spartan aesthetic of death is to die on the battlefield. The greatest glory you can achieve in your life is to do that. And not only will he never be able to achieve that great glory that the Spartans can achieve, but he also will have to live with the knowledge of his betrayal forever.
What's really incredible about the Battle of Thermopylae is actually that the Spartans lose. I mean, this is a defeat for the Greeks, but very quickly it goes down in popular legend as a victory, as a moral victory.
Herodotus describes Thermopylae as a catastrophe, but Herodotus had a very Athenian point of view. And I believe that we wouldn't have had a Plataea or a Salamis without Thermopylae. By humiliating the Persians to the point where Xerxes had Leonidas beheaded and put his head on a stake, and the Persians skulked by, still scared of him. It rallied the Greeks. It made them realize what they were.
And it is no coincidence that a year later, at the Battle of Plataea, the Greeks win, because they've been buoyed up by this notion that the Greeks are capable of anything. This became the most important event in Greek history. So Thermopylae became a legend almost before it became history.